Hi guys, we're back for week 3, War Strategies and Results. How did the Union win the Civil War? Remember, when we talk about the Union, we're talking about the original United States. Union Strategy, the North side. When the Civil War began, President Lincoln approved a military strategy suggested by Union General Winfield Scott. The strategy became known as the Anaconda Plan because a map of the battle plans resembled an anaconda, a type of snake that surrounds and strangles its prey. The strategy aimed to cut off the Confederacy from commerce and supplies. The Union imposed a naval blockade of southern ports and tried to control the Mississippi. All right, so what we're saying in this paragraph is that when the Civil War began, which was the war between the Union and the Confederate States, basically the North and the South, President Lincoln was our president, remember? So his strategy that they used was called the Anaconda Plan. Now, the anaconda, you guys, is a gigantic snake, okay? So it's a snake I don't want to be near. It's going to surround you, and then it's going to strangle you, and you're going to be dead. Anacondas, they don't mess around, okay? So in this plan, they were going to cut off the Confederacy. They weren't going to have supplies. They weren't going to be able to sell and trade. And the Union also imposed a naval blockade. So when we talk about the Navy, we're talking about the water. So we're talking about a blockade or a stopping of the southern ports, which means that when the Confederate ships would come in, they could not get into their ports or the places where they could dock their boats, okay? So that was the Union strategy. Now let's see what the Confederate strategy was. The Confederate strategy had 3 parts. One was to break the Union's blockade of southern waterways. Breaking the blockade would allow the Confederates to sell their cotton and to import weapons and other goods they could no longer obtain from the North. A second Confederate aim was to acquire allies. A foreign alliance would help convince the world that the Confederate cause was legitimate. The Confederates hoped European countries that brought Southern cotton would support them in the war. Finally, the Confederates desired to capture the Union capital of Washington, D.C. Conquering the capital would force the U.S. government to recognize the Confederacy as a separate country. Okay, so the Union had their one strategy. They basically wanted to block the Confederates and they wanted to strangle them and kill them. The Confederate side, they had 3 sides. They wanted to, number one, be able to get back into their ports. So the first thing they were going to do was break the blockade or destroy the Union's blockade or stopping of them to get into the port so that they could get into land. If the Confederate side could get into land, then they could continue to sell their cotton, which was cut off right now, and that was their money source. Remember, they also couldn't import weapons, which they needed, okay? They couldn't sell their cotton, and they couldn't get any more weapons from the North. The second thing the Confederate wanted to do was to get allies. Allies are people who work with you. So they thought, okay, these European countries, they buy our cotton, maybe they will fight with us and support us. That was the second thing they tried to do. And the last thing they wanted to do was they wanted to capture or win at war against the capital of the Union. The capital of the Union States was Washington, D.C. The capital of the United States today is Washington, D.C. So that didn't change. Okay. The Confederates tried to lure the border states into joining them because their location, manpower, and resources were strategically important. The Confederacy needed allies if it was going to break the blockade. It hoped for help from foreign countries whose economies depended on Southern cotton, particularly Great Britain. So this is just reiterating what we just talked about, that they needed to be able to get into their ports, to be able to sell their cotton, to be able to import or bring weapons in. So they were trying to look for allies or people to support them. The course of the war. The first 2 years of the war saw many deadly battles that did not gain either side much advantage. However, the longer the war lasted, the more the Confederate Army weakened. The Union blockade prevented the South from carrying on normal commerce and receiving any help via ship at any Southern port. Even if the South had been able to acquire allies, the blockade would have prevented much aid from arriving to help the South. Okay, so in the first couple years of the Civil War, nobody was really at an advantage. Nobody was really winning. But the longer the war went on, the Union or the North, they gained power, and the Confederate or the South, they actually began to weaken. So that blockade that the Union states put on there at the beginning of the Civil War, not allowing ships to get into the southern ports, that began to really, really hurt the South. If they can't get any goods in and they can't get any goods out, and they can't get, even if they can get allies or people to help them, if they can't get in and out by boat or send help by boat or send supplies by boat, that's really, really going to hurt the southern side. And it did. In 1863, Confederate General Lee's unsuccessful invasion of Pennsylvania, which marked the Confederacy's highest point, turned the tide of the war in favor of the Union. That same year, Union General Grant led a campaign to capture the Mississippi, including the strategic fort at Vicksburg, Mississippi. At this point, the Anaconda Plan was in place. The Confederacy was surrounded and isolated. Okay, so in 1863, remember General Lee, he wanted to invade Pennsylvania. It was not successful, and when the invasion of Pennsylvania wasn't successful, the war kind of shifted, and the Union side kind of picked up some speed and started having more power, and it started turning in the way of the Union or the United States, the northern side. Okay, remember at the beginning of this article, we talked about the Anaconda Plan. That was the Union's plan, like a snake, kind of surround and strangle. So in 1863, the Union side was successful in surrounding the Confederacy. In 1864, Union General Sherman led a devastating campaign across Georgia, convincing many observers that the Confederacy had little chance of winning the war. From the end of 1864 to early 1865, Lee's tired and starving troops desperately retreated through Virginia, with Grant in pursuit. In April, Lee finally surrendered. So, General Lee, he was on the Confederate side. His troops were tired, they were hungry, they couldn't get new people to come in, they couldn't get the supplies they needed because all the ports were all blocked off. So in April of 1865, General Lee and the Confederate side surrendered, and the Union won Civil War. All right, let me know if you have any questions. See you later, guys.